What happens when a man has everything? A billion-dollar empire, a name that commands respect, and a beautiful pregnant wife carrying his legacy. Now what happens when he risks it all for a moment of cruel vanity? In tonight's story, we enter the world of a man who, in front of the woman he swore to protect, chose to impress the one he shouldn't. A pregnant wife asks her husband for a simple hug, a moment of connection. Instead, he shoves her away. But this is not just a story of betrayal. It's a story of consequences of a fall so spectacular it creates a legend. Stay with us as we witness the shove that cost a millionaire everything and the instant gut-wrenching regret that followed. The air in their penthouse apartment was always the same, chilled to a precise 22 degrees Celsius, smelling faintly of Julian's expensive cologne and the white lilies Amelia arranged herself every morning. It was a beautiful prison, perched 50 stories above the bustling heart of the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the world she was no longer truly a part of. Amelia, 6 months into her pregnancy, often stood at those windows, her hands cradling the gentle swell of her belly, and watched the tiny, purposeful lights of the cars below, wondering if any of them held people who were genuinely happy. Her husband, Julian Croft, was a man sculpted from ambition and old money. His family's name was etched onto skyscrapers, university halls, and philanthropic plaques. He had inherited an empire, and to his credit, had doubled its worth with a kind of ruthless brilliance that both captivated and terrified the business world. He was handsome, with sharp, intelligent eyes, and a smile that could disarm world leaders, yet it rarely reached his eyes when he looked at her. In the beginning, their love had been a whirlwind. He had pursued her with a single-minded intensity that had left her breathless. He'd made her feel like the center of his vast universe. But once the wedding bands were on their fingers, the universe recentered itself around his true love, Croft Holdings. Amelia had become another one of his prized acquisitions, a beautiful accessory meant to produce the next heir. The pregnancy should have brought them closer. It had instead driven the final wedge between them. Amelia craved the simple things: a hand held during a walk, a shared laugh over a silly movie, a hug. Especially a hug. She felt the profound aching need for his arms to wrap around her, and the child growing within her, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together. But Julian's touch had become perfunctory, a brief kiss on the cheek in the morning, before he disappeared into a flurry of phone calls and a weary pat on the shoulder at night, before he turned his back to her in their king-sized bed. His distance had become a physical presence in their home, a cold ghost that sat between them at the dinner table. And recently that ghost had acquired a name, Isabella Rossi. Isabella was everything Amelia was not. She was far where Amelia was water. A sleek, raven-haired art dealer with a razor-sharp wit and a reputation for charming, powerful men. Julian insisted she was just a business associate, a vital connection for his new contemporary art foundation. But Amelia saw the way his eyes lingered on Isabella during the few events they all attended. She saw the private jokes, the shared glances that crackled with an energy he no longer reserved for his wife. She saw the texts that would make him smile at his phone, a smile she hadn't received in months. The breaking point was to be set against the most idyllic backdrop imaginable, the annual Croft Foundation Charity Gala held this year at the breathtaking Banyan Tree Phuket in Thailand. Julian had booked out a significant portion of the ultra-exclusive resort. It was a masterful display of wealth and power, with billionaires, politicians, and socialites flying in from all corners of the globe. For Amelia, it was just a larger, more opulent cage. She had spent weeks dreading it. Her body was changing, and while she was proud of the life she was nurturing, she felt ungainly and tired. The couture gowns Julian's assistant had procured for her felt like costumes. On the night of the gala, she chose a flowing emerald green silk dress that draped elegantly over her bump. She'd had her hair styled in soft waves and wore the sapphire earrings Julian had given her on their first anniversary. She hoped with a desperate, foolish flicker of optimism that he might look at her and see the woman he had married, not just the vessel for his heir. The gala was in full swing on a sprawling terrace overlooking the Andaman Sea. The sunset bled across the sky in hues of orange and violet, a perfect postcard that felt like a mockery of her inner turmoil. Fairy lights twinkled in the palm trees, and the soft strains of a string quartet mingled with the clinking of champagne glasses and murmured conversations. Julian was in his element, a king holding court. He moved through the crowd with an easy, predatory grace, shaking hands, clapping backs, his laughter booming with confidence. Amelia followed a few steps behind a dutiful shadow. He introduced her as my lovely wife Amelia, with a proprietary hand on the small of her back, but the gesture felt like a brand, not an embrace. And then she saw her. Isabella. She was standing near the marble balustrade, holding a flute of champagne, looking like a panther in a sea of swans. She wore a backless crimson dress that clung to her every curve. She was laughing with a senator, her head tilted back, a column of pale throat exposed. When she saw Julian, her red-lipped smile widened. Julian's path changed course, veering directly towards Isabella Amelia, still in tow. "Isabella, you look sensational," Julian said, his voice a low purr that Amelia hadn't heard directed at her in years. "Julian, darling," Isabella responded, her eyes flicking dismissively over Amelia's baby bump before locking back onto Julian. "You certainly know how to throw a party. The ambiance is divine." "Only the best," he said, his ego preening under her praise. They fell into an easy, exclusive conversation, their bodies angled towards each other, creating an invisible wall that shut Amelia out. They talked about art auctions in Geneva and vineyard acquisitions in Tuscany. Amelia stood there, a silent, pregnant ghost, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. She could feel the whispers, the pitying glances from the other wives who knew the score. Her cheeks burned with a humiliation that was hot and suffocating. She needed an anchor. She needed to feel, just for a second, that she wasn't completely alone on this island of gilded misery. All she wanted was a hug, a simple grounding hug from the man who was the father of her child. She took a small step forward, gently touching his arm. "Julian," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned his brow, furrowing in annoyance at the interruption. "What is it, Amelia? I was just wondering if I could have a hug," she asked, the words feeling fragile and pathetic in the humid night air. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was such a small request, a plea for a crumb of affection. Isabella watched them, a smirk playing on her lips. Her eyes held a cruel, triumphant gleam. It was a test, and she knew it. Julian looked from Amelia's pleading, vulnerable face to Isabella's cool, challenging one. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Was it irritation? Contempt? In that split second, he made a choice. He chose his audience. He chose his mistress. "Amelia, for God's sake, don't be so needy." He snapped, his voice sharp and loud enough for those nearby to hear. This isn't the time or the place. And then he did it. As she instinctively swayed closer, seeking the comfort she'd begged for, he raised a hand and shoved her away. It wasn't a violent, brutal push, but it was firm, decisive, and utterly dismissive. He pushed her by the shoulder, a gesture that said, "You are in my way. You are an embarrassment." Amelia stumbled backward, her heel catching on the smooth marble floor. The gasp that escaped her lips was silent, stolen by the shock. The world seemed to slow down. The music, the chatter, the sound of the ocean, it all faded into a dull roar. The only thing she could see was Julian's face, cold and dismissive, and Isabella's triumphant smirk, a victory flag planted on the ruins of her heart. In that horrifying, crystal-clear moment, Amelia understood. She was not his partner. She was not his love. She was a contract, a duty, and in that moment, an obstacle. The shove hadn't just pushed her body away. It had shattered the last fragile pane of glass that was her hope for their marriage. And as she stood there swaying slightly, her hand flying protectively to her belly, she saw the first flicker of something else in Julian's eyes. It was faint, a tiny spark in the cold darkness. It was the dawning, sickening realization of what he had just done, broadcast on a stage of his own making. It was the shadow of instant regret. The regret in Julian's eyes was a fleeting thing, a brief storm cloud passing over a barren landscape. It was the regret of a strategist who had made a tactical error, not the remorse of a husband who had wounded his wife. He had miscalculated. The shove had been too public, the gasp from the surrounding guests too audible. He saw the shift in their expressions, from admiration to shock, from envy to thinly veiled contempt. He had wanted to look powerful and detached in front of Isabella. Instead, he looked like a bully. Isabella's smirk widened for a fraction of a second before she masterfully replaced it with a look of feigned concern. She laid a hand on Julian's arm, a gesture of proprietary comfort. "Oh dear," she murmured, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Is she all right? Pregnancy can make one so emotional." The word emotional was a dagger painting Amelia as unstable, her request for a hug as a symptom of a hysterical condition. It was a perfect venomous defense of Julian's cruelty. But Amelia didn't hear her. She was locked in a bubble of ringing silence. The shove itself hadn't hurt her physically. It was the sheer brutal symbolism of the act. He had physically cast her out. In front of everyone. In front of her. The humiliation was a physical force pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her vision swam the twinkling fairy lights, blurring into meaningless streaks of color. She didn't cry. She didn't scream or cause a scene. Something within her, something that had been slowly dying for months, finally broke. And in its place a strange and terrible calm began to settle. It was the calm of absolute certainty. The calm of knowing there was nothing left to save. With a quiet dignity that belied the storm raging inside her, Amelia straightened up. She looked directly at Julian, her gaze holding his for a long, silent moment. She wanted to sear the image into her memory, the man she had loved standing beside his mistress, his face a mask of annoyance and ill-conceived damage control. She let him see the raw, unfiltered pain in her eyes, but she did not give him the satisfaction of her tears. Then she turned. Without another word, she walked away. She didn't storm off or flee. Her steps were measured and deliberate as she navigated through the sea of stunned faces. The crowd parted for her as if she were a ghost, their whispers following her like the rustle of dead leaves. She walked past the string quartet, past the cascading floral arrangements, and out of the light of the terrace, disappearing into the shadows of the resort's lush, winding pathways. Julian watched her go, a knot of cold fury and anxiety tightening in his gut. Fury at her for creating the situation, and a gnawing anxiety about the consequences. He had to fix this. He had to control the narrative. "She's just overtired," he said loudly to the nearest cluster of guests, forcing a dismissive chuckle. "You know how it is. We'll have a nightcap and she'll be right as rain in the morning." He turned back to Isabella, expecting her to help him smooth things over. But Isabella was no longer looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on something over his shoulder, her eyes wide with genuine alarm. "Julian," she breathed, her voice tight. Following her gaze, Julian turned and looked back towards the terrace entrance, where Amelia had just disappeared. The space was now filled with panicked resort staff, their crisp white uniforms a stark contrast to the evening's glamour. A man in a suit was speaking urgently into a walkie-talkie. The word he kept repeating cut through the renewed chatter of the party guests' tsunami. A low, guttural roar began to build a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth, drowning out the string quartet. It was a sound utterly alien to the tranquil paradise. The sea, which moments before had been a placid sheet of purple and black, was behaving strangely. The water was rapidly receding from the shoreline, exposing coral and sand that hadn't seen the air in decades, as if the ocean itself was taking a deep, monstrous breath. Panic erupted. The carefully constructed facade of the gala shattered in an instant. The clinking of glasses was replaced with screams. Billionaires and dignitaries, stripped of their power and prestige, became just terrified people. A primal stampeding fear took hold as the staff trained for this very possibility began shouting directions to the high ground. "Everyone, move to the main hall. Now move." Julian stood frozen for a second, his mind struggling to process the two seismic events that had occurred in the space of 3 minutes. The personal earthquake of his actions, and the literal one that was now promising to swallow them whole. His first instinct, the one ingrained in him since birth, was self-preservation. He grabbed Isabella's arm. "Come on," he yelled over the growing roar. "We have to go." But as he started to pull her towards the designated safe zone, a different, more terrifying thought pierced through his panic. Amelia. She had walked off into the darkness towards the low-lying villas that dotted the path back to their private suite. She was alone, emotional, and walking directly into the path of the impending wave. The image of her pregnant and vulnerable flashed in his mind. The baby, his heir, his child. The instant regret he'd felt after the shove was a pale, insignificant thing compared to the tidal wave of pure terror that crashed over him now. The potential loss of social standing was nothing compared to the potential loss of his wife and child. "Julian, what are you doing?" Isabella shrieked, trying to pull him back as he let go of her and turned against the tide of fleeing guests. "The safe zone is this way." He ignored her. For the first time that night, for the first time in months, Isabella Rossi and her opinion were utterly irrelevant. He pushed through the panicked crowd, his eyes scanning the dark, winding pathways that led down towards the sea. Amelia, he screamed, his voice raw, with a fear he had never known. Amelia. The world was chaos. People were tripping, falling their evening finery becoming a hindrance. The roar of the ocean was now deafening, a physical pressure against his eardrums. He saw the first signs of the returning water in the distance, not a gentle wave, but a churning, angry white line on the horizon, growing taller with impossible speed. He ran his heart, pounding a frantic rhythm of her name. Amelia, Amelia, Amelia. He stumbled down the path she had taken his mind, a maelstrom of horrific possibilities. The shove, his cruel words, her devastated face. What if that was the last time he ever saw her? What if his last words to her were a dismissive snap? The carefully constructed walls of Julian Croft's world were not just cracking, they were being pulverized by a force of nature and a force of his own making. In his desperation running towards the woman he had just pushed away, he understood a terrifying truth. He had shoved her directly into the path of annihilation, and if he didn't find her, her ghost and his regret would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. The tsunami, when it came, was not the towering monster of cinematic nightmares, but it was powerful enough to be catastrophic. The first wave surged through the lower levels of the resort, a churning torrent of seawater, sand, and debris. It smashed through the glass walls of the beachfront villas, obliterated the immaculate gardens, and turned the serene pathways into raging canals. Julian found Amelia not a moment too soon. He had spotted her near a small ornamental bridge, dazed and disoriented by the alarms and the roar. He'd reached her just as the water surged up the hillside, grabbing her hand and pulling her up a steep stone staircase that led to the resort's main elevated lobby, the designated high ground safe zone. They had made it with seconds to spare, the water licking at the steps below them. In the chaotic aftermath, huddled among hundreds of other shell-shocked guests and staff in the grand lobby. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a chilling silence between them. Julian, panting and soaked, tried to speak the words. "I'm sorry," forming on his lips, but they felt hollow and absurd in the face of what had just happened. Amelia, however, seemed unnervingly calm. She was dry, safe, but her focus was entirely inward. Her hand rested on her belly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then her face went pale, and she winced a sharp intake of breath. "Amelia, what is it? Are you hurt?" Julian asked, his voice thick with a new kind of fear. "It's the baby," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Something's wrong. It's too soon." She clutched her abdomen as another wave of pain hit her, more intense this time. The stress, the emotional devastation, the panicked run, it had all been too much. The resort's on-site medic, a harried but competent Australian doctor, rushed to her side. After a quick, tense examination amidst the chaos, his face grew grim. "She's having contractions," he said to Julian, his voice low and urgent. "They're premature, but they're consistent. The fall she mentioned, and the severe emotional distress, it can trigger this. We need to get her to a proper hospital, now." The unraveling of Julian Croft's perfect life was swift and merciless. The tsunami had crippled the local infrastructure. Getting off the island was a logistical nightmare. But Julian, for the first time, used his immense power for something other than profit. He was a man possessed. He barked orders into his satellite phone, chartering a helicopter, arranging for a medical team to be on standby at the best international hospital in Bangkok. He spared no expense, his desperation a blank check. During the tense helicopter ride, Amelia refused to look at him. She lay on a stretcher, her face a mask of pain and focus, attended by a medic. All of Julian's power, all his wealth was useless. He couldn't stop her pain. He couldn't undo what he had done. He was just a terrified man in a very expensive helicopter, watching the woman he had broken fight for the life of their child. At the hospital in Bangkok, she was whisked away into the maternity emergency wing. Julian was left in a sterile white waiting room that felt colder and more isolating than his penthouse. Hours bled into one another. He tried to call his office to manage the fallout from the gala, but the words and figures on his screen were meaningless. His entire empire felt like a pile of ash compared to the closed door of the delivery room. Isabella called. He saw her name flash on the screen and swiped to decline without a second thought. She called again. He turned the phone off. The thought of her, of their flirtation, of the shove that had been for her benefit, filled him with a self-loathing so profound it made him physically sick. Finally, a doctor, a kind-faced Thai woman, entered the waiting room. Her expression was guarded. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice gentle. "Your wife has been stabilized. We've managed to stop the premature labor for now. She and the baby are resting." Relief washed over Julian so intensely his knees felt weak. "Oh, thank God. Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated. "She is resting and she has requested not to have any visitors at the moment. I'm not a visitor. I'm her husband. Mr. Croft." The doctor said, her gaze firm but compassionate. "Your wife has been through a significant ordeal, both physically and emotionally. The preliminary reports from the Phuket medic mentioned acute emotional distress as a primary trigger. For the health of the pregnancy, it is imperative that she remain in a stress-free, calm environment. We must respect her wishes." The message was clear. You are the stress. You are the danger. Defeated. Julian sank into a chair. He was barred from seeing his own wife. He was the cause of the crisis. He ran his hands over his face, the mask of the invincible tycoon stripped away, leaving only a broken man. It was in this moment of utter desolation that a new piece of information arrived, delivered by his head of security via a terse email. While Julian had been focused on Amelia, his team had been vetting the gala's attendees, a standard post-event procedure. Usually he would have ignored the report, but he opened it, desperate for any distraction. And there, under Isabella Rossi's name, was a note that made the blood drain from his face. Isabella Rossi. Name is an alias. Real name, Isabella Rinaldi. Father Marco Rinaldi. Former CEO of Rinaldi Holdings, a major competitor that Croft Holdings acquired in a hostile takeover 10 years ago. Marco Rinaldi committed suicide 3 months after the acquisition. Isabella would have been 19. The world tilted on its axis. It wasn't about art deals or charming a powerful man. It had never been about that. It was about revenge. Isabella hadn't been a dalliance. She had been an enemy combatant. Every smile, every shared secret, every flattering word had been a weapon. She had been systematically dismantling his life from the inside, and he had welcomed her in handing her the tools himself. She had targeted his greatest vulnerability, his ego and his marriage. The public humiliation at the gala wasn't just a byproduct of her seduction, it was the entire point. She had wanted to break him, and she had chosen the most public, most intimate way to do it. The shove had not been her test for him. It had been her graduation ceremony. She had succeeded. He thought back to every conversation, how she'd subtly advised him on a risky acquisition that was now underperforming, how she'd casually mentioned a rumor that had led him to fire a loyal, long-standing board member. It was all a tapestry of sabotage, and he had been too arrogant, too blinded by her flattery to see it. He sat in the silent, sterile hospital waiting room, 1,000 miles from home, barred from his wife's bedside, his unborn child's life hanging in the balance, and the full scope of his stupidity laid bare. He had not just been cruel, he had been a fool. He had pushed away the one person who had ever truly been on his side for a woman who was actively engineering his downfall. The regret was no longer a flicker or a storm. It was a permanent, poisoning part of his soul. The unraveling was complete. He had lost everything that mattered, all by his own hand. For a week, the hospital was Amelia's sanctuary and Julian's purgatory. The doctors placed her on strict bed rest, monitoring the baby around the clock. The threat of premature labor had subsided, but it loomed like a constant unspoken threat. In the quiet of her private room, with the rhythmic beep of the fetal heart monitor, as her only companion, Amelia, began to heal. The healing, however, was not of the kind Julian would have hoped for. It was not a healing that would lead back to him. The shock had given way to a profound, crystalline clarity. Every excuse she had ever made for him, every hope she had clung to, dissolved. The shove was not an aberration. It was a revelation. It was the truest expression of his regard for her. She thought about Isabella not with hatred, but with a strange sense of pity. To be so consumed with someone else's destruction was its own kind of prison. Amelia in her sterile white room felt freer than she had in years. Julian, meanwhile, was a ghost haunting the hospital corridors. He had booked the suite opposite hers, leaving the door ajar, in the vain hope that she might emerge. He sent flowers, but they were politely returned by the nurses. He sent handwritten apologies, long rambling letters, filled with his newfound revelations about Isabella and his own foolishness, but she never acknowledged them. He was a king without a kingdom, a general with no one to command. His only contact was the compassionate doctor who gave him curt professional updates. The baby's heartbeat is strong. Mrs. Croft is responding well to the treatment. Never your wife. Always Mrs. Croft. His reckoning came on the 8th day. A sharp, professionally dressed woman he didn't recognize arrived at the hospital. She introduced herself as Eleanor Vance, Amelia's lawyer. She was a woman in her late 40s, with intelligent eyes that held no sympathy whatsoever. She handed him a thick envelope. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "My client, Amelia Croft, has instructed me to serve you these papers. They are a petition for legal separation to be followed by a divorce upon the birth of the child." Julian stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "A divorce? She can't. We haven't even spoken. My client feels there is nothing left to be said," Eleanor Vance replied coolly. "Furthermore, she has instructed me to activate Clause 11B of your prenuptial agreement." Julian's blood ran cold. He knew his own prenup by heart. It was an ironclad fortress of his own design, meant to protect his ancestral wealth from any and all claims. Clause 11B. He scrambled to remember the specifics. It was a minor clause, one his lawyers had insisted on as a show of good faith at the time. Something he had dismissed as sentimental nonsense. Clause 11B. The lawyer said, as if reading his mind, the infidelity and endangerment clause. It states that in the event of proven marital infidelity that leads to proven physical or emotional endangerment of the spouse or unborn children, a significant portion of shared assets acquired during the marriage are to be transferred to the injured party for the explicit purpose of securing their and the child's lifelong welfare. Her medical reports from Phuket and this hospital, citing acute emotional distress as the trigger for her premature labor, constitute proof of endangerment. And we have over a dozen sworn affidavits from guests at the gala who witnessed your public affair with Ms. Rossi and the subsequent physical assault. Julian felt the floor drop out from under him. That clause was symbolic. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be exactly what it is, Mr. Croft. A consequence. Amelia is not seeking your fortune. She is securing her child's future, a future independent of you. The assets listed for transfer include the Tribeca townhouse and a controlling interest in the Archlight Fund, the seed fund you started with her inheritance, if I'm not mistaken. He was stunned into silence. Amelia's inheritance, a modest sum he had scoffed at, but agreed to invest for her, had been the seed for one of his most successful venture capital funds. He had grown it into a multi-million-dollar asset. An asset that, according to this, was now legally hers. She wasn't just leaving him. She was taking a piece of his empire with her, a piece he had built from her own forgotten capital. It was a move of such strategic brilliance, he would have admired it if it weren't being used against him. "She can't do this alone," he finally stammered. "She doesn't know anything about managing a fund." Eleanor Vance allowed herself a small, cold smile. "You've underestimated your wife for a very long time, Mr. Croft. You might be surprised to learn that before she met you, Amelia was completing her MBA with a specialization in venture capitalism, a degree she abandoned to support your career. She is more than capable." This was a version of Amelia he didn't know, a part of her past he had never bothered to learn. The quiet, gentle woman he had married had a mind like a steel trap, and he had foolishly left the key in the lock. His phone buzzed. It was his CFO. He answered, his voice hollow. "Julian, we have a problem," his CFO said, his voice strained with panic. "A big one. The Rinaldi leak." Julian's heart sank even further. "What leak?" "It's everywhere. An anonymous source has leaked documents to the press. Damning documents. Details of the hostile takeover of Rinaldi Holdings. Internal memos about the pressure campaign. They're painting you as the man who drove Marco Rinaldi to suicide. And the source also leaked evidence of your affair with his daughter Isabella. They're framing it as you preying on the vulnerable child of the man you destroyed. It's a character assassination, Julian. Our stock is plummeting. The board is calling for an emergency meeting. It was Isabella's masterstroke, her final devastating blow. She hadn't just humiliated him personally. She had used their affair as the accelerant to burn his corporate reputation to the ground. She had perfectly crafted a narrative that made him look like a monster. He ended the call, his hand trembling. In the space of 10 minutes, he had been served divorce papers, lost a significant asset to the wife he'd scorned, and had his public image and his company's stock shredded by the mistress he'd courted. He looked up at Elena Vance, who was watching him with detached professionalism. Tell her I'll sign." He said the words, tasting like ash. There was no fight left in him. He had been outmaneuvered by two women he had fundamentally, fatally misjudged. He was no longer in control. This was not a negotiation or a problem he could solve with money. This was a reckoning. It was the bill for his cruelty, his arrogance, his blindness, and it had finally come due. He was alone in a hospital corridor, stripped of his wife, his pride, and a piece of his empire, with the rest of it burning down around him. While Julian's world was imploding, Amelia's was quietly being rebuilt on her own terms. After 2 weeks, she was discharged from the Bangkok hospital stable, but still fragile. She did not return to the gilded cage of the penthouse. Instead, Elena Vance arranged for her to be flown by private medical jet, not to their shared home city, but to Geneva, Switzerland. There, nestled by the lake, was a quiet private clinic known for its discretion and excellent prenatal care. This was Amelia's first move, and it was a brilliant one. By relocating to neutral territory, she placed herself physically and legally outside of Julian's immediate sphere of influence. She created a sanctuary where she could focus on her health and plan her next steps without the threat of his presence. The Archlight Fund, now legally under her control, became her project. From her sunlit room overlooking Lake Geneva, she didn't just rest. She worked. She pulled up the files on her tablet. Her mind, once dulled by years of being a socialite, now sparking with its old fire. The MBA she had abandoned felt like a lifetime ago, but the knowledge was still there, dormant but intact. She saw the fund's potential, but she also saw Julian's reckless, ego-driven investments. She saw the rot he had allowed to creep in while he was distracted by Isabella. She wasn't alone in this. Her lawyer, Elena Vance, was more than just a legal eagle. She was a connector. She introduced Amelia via secure video calls to a new financial advisor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sophia, who had a reputation for turning troubled funds around. Sophia, it turned out, had her own history with Julian Croft. He had once pushed her out of a major deal, dismissing her as too cautious. The opportunity to help Amelia dismantle a piece of his empire was a challenge she relished. Together, the three women, Amelia the strategist, Elena the legal shield, and Sophia the financial weapon, formed an unlikely but formidable alliance. Their counterattack was not loud or explosive. It was silent, precise, and devastating. Amelia's first directive was to liquidate all the high-risk, flashy assets Julian had acquired. This included a stake in a volatile tech startup and a portfolio of abstract art Julian had purchased on Isabella's expert advice. Sophia executed the sales with ruthless efficiency, staunching the bleeding and freeing up capital. The art, purchased at an inflated price, sold for a fraction of its cost, solidifying the fact that Isabella's advice had been pure sabotage. Next, Amelia guided Sophia to reinvest in stable long-term growth sectors that Julian had ignored: renewable energy, biotechnology, and sustainable agriculture. These were fields she had been passionate about during her studies, fields Julian had laughed off as unsexy. It was a quiet rebellion, a complete reversal of his financial philosophy. The fund was being reborn in her image, patient, intelligent, and forward-thinking. Meanwhile, the Rinaldi leak that Isabella had engineered was having catastrophic effects on Croft Holdings. The stock was in freefall. The board, once a collection of Julian's sycophants, was now in open revolt. They were terrified of the public relations nightmare. The story was too sordid, too perfect. The corporate predator destroying a rival, then seducing and betraying the man's orphaned daughter. It didn't matter that Isabella was a willing participant and a saboteur herself. The narrative was set in stone. This was where Elena Vance played her MasterCard. She had been digging into Isabella's life, and she found more than just her true identity. She found Isabella's weakness. Isabella, for all her cunning, was not a financial genius. She had been propped up by a silent partner, someone who had funded her elaborate lifestyle and given her the capital to appear as a legitimate art dealer. Elena's investigators uncovered this partner. It was Marcus Thorne, Julian's biggest corporate rival, the head of Thorne Industries. Thorne had been the one whispering in Isabella's ear, guiding her revenge and using her as a pawn in his long-running war with Julian. The goal was simple: destabilize Croft Holdings from the inside with the affair and the bad investments. Then from the outside, with the PR scandal, driving the stock price so low that Thorn Industries could initiate a hostile takeover of its own. Instead of leaking this information to the press, which would be messy and unpredictable, Eleanor did something far more clever. She arranged a private off-the-record meeting with two of the most powerful and now most nervous members of the Croft Holdings board. In that meeting, she laid out the entire conspiracy. She presented the evidence of Isabella's true identity, her connection to Thorn, and the coordinated attack on their company. But she didn't offer this information for free. Her price was simple. In exchange for the evidence that would save their company from Thorn's clutches, the board was to approve a full uncontested settlement for Amelia's divorce, one that formally and permanently signed over the Archlight Fund and the Tribeca townhouse with no further legal challenges. Secondly, they were to publicly issue a statement clearing Amelia's name of any involvement and acknowledging the immense personal distress she had suffered. Cornered, the board members had no choice. Saving the multi-billion-dollar corporation was more important than protecting their disgraced CEO's assets. They agreed. Julian found out when his own board served him the ultimatum. They confronted him with the evidence of the Thorn conspiracy. They informed him that they had already made a deal with his wife's lawyer. He was to step down as CEO, at least temporarily issue a public apology, and not contest the divorce settlement. If he refused, they would oust him publicly and leave him to fight Thorn on his own. The regret Julian felt had now morphed into a state of perpetual shock. He had believed he was the player, the master of the game. But he had been a pawn for everyone. A pawn for Isabella in her quest for revenge. A pawn for Marcus Thorn in his corporate war, and now a pawn for his own board in their bid for survival. The ultimate checkmate, however, came from Amelia. In a final, devastatingly elegant move, the newly restructured Archlight Fund under Amelia's control used its fresh capital to buy a significant block of Croft Holdings stock at its rock-bottom price. It wasn't a controlling interest, but it was large enough to give her a seat at the table, a voice in the company's future. Julian sat in his empty penthouse, the lilies long since wilted, watching the business news. A chyron slid across the bottom of the screen. Archlight Fund, headed by newly appointed CEO Amelia Croft, acquires major stake in beleaguered Croft Holdings. He had pushed her away, and in doing so he had not only lost her, but he had inadvertently created his most formidable business rival. She hadn't just left him. She had circled back and was now in a position of power over the very empire he had prized above her. The counterattack was complete. He had nothing left. Julian Croft hit rock bottom not with a bang, but with the deafening silence of an empty life. The board had forced him into a leave of absence, a polite term for exile. He was still the majority shareholder, but he was a king with no crown barred from the building that bore his family's name. His days were a long, echoing stretch of nothing. He'd walk the halls of the penthouse, the silence amplifying the memories of Amelia's gentle presence, a presence he had so carelessly erased. He tried to fight back. He called Isabella once, a last desperate attempt to understand. She answered, her voice cold and bored. "What do you want, Julian?" Why was all he could manage. She laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "You really don't know. You destroyed my father. You stood at his funeral and talked about necessary market corrections. You took our legacy and sold it for parts. I just returned the favor. I took your legacy, your perfect wife, your perfect reputation, and showed the world how hollow it was. Consider us even." She hung up. There was no remorse, no emotion. It was simply a transaction, now complete. His isolation was absolute. His fair-weather friends had vanished. His business associates now saw him as toxic. He was left with nothing but his money and the gaping wound where his life used to be. The regret was no longer a thought or an emotion. It was the air he breathed. It was in the taste of his food, the reflection in the mirror. He saw his actions on a continuous loop. His dismissal of Amelia, his vanity with Isabella, the shove. That damnable, arrogant, life-altering shove. He knew he had to see her. Not to ask for forgiveness. He knew he was far beyond that. But to perform one last necessary act. He needed to surrender. He flew to Geneva. He didn't know where she was staying, but he didn't need to. He went to the offices of Archlight Fund, now headquartered in a sleek modern building overlooking the Rhone. He simply sat in the lobby, a ghost in a $1,000 suit, and waited. After 3 hours, Elena Vance appeared. Her expression was as unforgiving as ever. "She will see you," she said, her tone suggesting it was against her better judgment. 5 minutes. Her doctor is present. Any sign of distress, and you will be removed." He was led not to an office, but to a comfortable, sunlit lounge. Amelia was there, sitting on a sofa. She was now heavily pregnant, her due date clearly approaching. She looked radiant. Motherhood suited her. There was a calm strength in her eyes he had never seen before. A discreet older woman, her doctor, sat in a nearby chair. Amelia didn't smile, but her face was not filled with the hatred he expected. It was something far more unnerving neutrality. She looked at him as if he were a business acquaintance from a long-ago forgotten deal. "Julian," she said, her voice steady. He had rehearsed 100 speeches, but they all evaporated in her presence. He was left with only the raw, ugly truth. "Amelia," he began, his voice cracking. "I didn't come here to ask you to take me back. I didn't come to make excuses. I know what I did. I know who I was." He took a step closer, but stopped when he saw Elena tense. "The night of the gala. When I pushed you, it wasn't just about Isabella. It was about me. It was because you asked for something real, something honest. And I had become so fake that I couldn't handle it. Your request for a hug felt like an accusation. It held up a mirror to the man I'd become, a hollow shell. And I hated what I saw. So I broke the mirror. I pushed you away because it was easier than facing myself." Tears welled in his eyes, hot and shameful. These were not tears of self-pity, but tears of genuine, agonizing clarity. Everything that has happened since losing the company, the money, my reputation, I deserve it. All of it. I see that now. Isabella didn't destroy me. I destroyed myself. I had the single most valuable thing in the universe, a woman who loved me, a family. And I traded it for vanity. It was the stupidest, most unforgivable deal I ever made. He finally looked at her, at the child she carried. His child. He or she. Our baby deserves better than me. Better than the man I was. I know that. I'm not asking for a role in your life. I'm forfeiting my claim. I'm here to sign whatever you need me to sign. I'll provide whatever financial support you ask, but I will stay away. I won't contaminate your peace. You have built something new, something better from the mess I made. You deserve to have it free and clear of me." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single document, placing it on the coffee table. It was a legal affidavit drafted by his own lawyer, relinquishing his parental rights to be enacted at her sole discretion. It was the only thing he had left, to give her his absence. Amelia looked at the document, then back at him. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It was not anger or love, but a deep, profound sorrow. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said softly. "I never wanted to take your empire, Julian. I never wanted to ruin you. I just wanted a husband. And this child will need a father." She picked up the affidavit, and in a single decisive movement, she tore it in half, then in half again, and let the pieces fall to the table. "I will not take your rights away," she said, her voice gaining strength. "That's your decision to earn back. This isn't a company to be acquired or a contract to be signed. This is a life. Our child will know who his father is. He will know the good, and he will know the bad. And it will be up to you and you alone to show him what kind of man you are going to be, not what kind of man you were." Just then Amelia drew a sharp breath, her hand flying to her belly. She looked at her doctor with wide eyes. I think it's time." The calm atmosphere of the room shattered. The doctor was instantly by her side. Elena was on the phone. And Julian stood there frozen as the climax of his downfall collided with the climax of Amelia's new beginning. He was about to become a father in the wreckage of his life, having just been handed the slimmest, most impossible chance at redemption by the very woman he had so utterly broken. He could not earn back her love, but she was giving him the chance to earn his son's. The final confrontation was over. The real work was about to begin. 2 years later, the world was different. In her Tribeca townhouse, bought with her own success, Amelia ran the thriving Archlight Fund with a quiet confidence that was respected throughout the financial world. The ashes of her old life had given way to a new dawn, one she had built herself. Her greatest accomplishment, however, was not her portfolio, but her son Leo, a bright-eyed toddler with his father's dark hair, who was currently building a wobbly tower of blocks on the living room floor. Julian Croft was no longer a king. Stripped of his empire and his pride, he had embarked on a quiet, painstaking path of redemption. His life was no longer about acquisitions and power plays. It was about consistency therapy and learning how to be a father. He and Amelia were not together that bridge had been permanently burned, but he was a fixed point in his son's life. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. It was 2:00 on Saturday. Amelia opened the door. Julian stood there, not as a tycoon in a bespoke suit, but as a father in jeans and a polo shirt. The haunted desperation that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a humble calm. Before a word was exchanged, a joyous shriek of "Dada" came from the living room. Leo toddled forward, his little arms outstretched. A smile of pure, unadorned love transformed Julian's face. He knelt, opening his arms, and scooped his son into a hug. It was the kind of hug Amelia had once so desperately craved, effortless, genuine, and full of an affection he was once incapable of giving. It was a simple gesture, yet it held the entire weight of his transformation. Watching them, Amelia felt a profound and lasting peace. The ghost of the woman who was shoved away had finally faded, replaced by the powerful creator of this new life. She had not sought reconciliation, but had offered the grace for him to change. Theirs was not a fairy tale of a couple reunited, but something more raw and real, a story of individual salvation. In losing everything he thought he wanted, Julian had finally learned how to give the one thing that mattered. The act of cruelty that had shattered their world had in the end created the space for them both to be saved. And so the empire of a millionaire, built on ambition and arrogance, crumbled with a single heartless shove. But from those ruins, something far more valuable grew. Amelia's journey teaches us that our lowest moments can become the bedrock for our greatest strengths. She didn't just survive. She thrived, building a life of purpose and power on her own terms. Julian's story is a stark reminder that regret is only the beginning. True redemption isn't found in grand apologies, but in the quiet, consistent, and humble work of becoming a better human being day by day. This wasn't a story about a marriage being saved, but about two individuals finding their true selves in the wreckage. What did you think of Amelia's ultimate decision? Let us know in the comments below. He told me I was his future, the one he was leaving his fragile wife for. He'd whisper it against my skin in the penthouse overlooking Central Park. The city lights a glittering promise of the life we'd build. He said she was a ghost in their marriage, a placeholder until I came along. But then the door to our love nest swung open, and there she was, his pregnant, fragile wife. And in her hands, she held not divorce papers, but the inheritance documents that turned his multi-billion-dollar empire to dust, and his promises to me into lies. The city of New York always glittered, but from the 82nd floor penthouse of the 157 skyscraper, it was a galaxy laid at your feet. This was Adrian Sterling's world, a universe he commanded with the same ruthless precision he used to build his real estate empire. Tonight, however, the master of the universe was a humble supplicant, his lips tracing a reverent path along the porcelain skin of Chloe Duvall. "You," he murmured, his voice a low thrum against her neck, "are the only real thing in my life." Chloe arched into him, a languid, feline stretch. Her fingers tipped with immaculate crimson, tangled in his dark, expertly styled hair. "And what about Amelia?" She purred the name, a deliberate, silken dart. Adrian's breath hitched for a fraction of a second. "Amelia is an obligation, a memory, a ghost in a house that was never a home." He lifted his head, his impossibly blue eyes locking with hers. They were the color of a summer sky, a sky that promised endless warmth, a sky that Chloe had convinced herself was hers alone to bask in. "You are my future, Chloe, the mother of my children, the real Mrs. Sterling." The words were a potent cocktail of everything she'd ever craved: security status, and above all, victory. Chloe, a former gallery assistant who had learned early that her beauty was a currency, had invested 5 years of her life in Adrian. 5 years of stolen weekends, clandestine dinners, and the gnawing, ever-present reality of being the other woman. But she wasn't just any mistress. She was an investment banker's daughter who had seen her family lose everything. She knew the value of a sure thing, and Adrian Sterling, with his chiseled jaw and a net worth that flirted with the GDP of a small nation, was the surest thing in Manhattan. "Prove it," she challenged, her voice a seductive whisper. "The Amelia problem. When does it go away?" Adrian sighed, a theatrical sound of a man burdened by the weight of his own honor. "Soon, my love. Very soon. Her pregnancy, it complicates things. She's so fragile, so delicate. The doctor says any stress could be detrimental. Fragile. Delicate." The words painted a picture of a wilting flower, a porcelain doll that might shatter at the slightest touch. This was the image Adrian had carefully cultivated of his wife Amelia Sterling. And Chloe had bought it wholesale. She pictured a mousy, unassuming woman, probably swathed in beige cashmere. Her days a monotonous cycle of charity luncheons and waiting for a husband who was never coming home. A woman utterly oblivious to the vibrant, passionate world Adrian shared with her. A few miles downtown in a sprawling pre-war apartment on Park Avenue, the supposedly fragile Amelia Sterling was not wilting. She was in fact methodically reviewing a stack of legal documents with a focus that would have made a seasoned litigator proud. Her baby bump, a prominent, perfect sphere under a simple silk blouse, was the only soft curve in a room filled with the sharp angles of law books and financial reports. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her private investigator, a terse man named Mr. Jones. "He's at the penthouse. She's with him," as predicted. Amelia's fingers steady and unadorned, save for a simple platinum wedding band, typed a reply. "Thank you, Jones. Continue surveillance. I need the timeline airtight." She stood and walked over to the grand window, looking out at the same city skyline that Chloe was currently claiming as her own. But Amelia saw something different. She didn't see a glittering promise. She saw a battlefield, and she had been preparing for this war for a very long time. Amelia wasn't a fool. She had known about Chloe for 3 of the 5 years Chloe had been with Adrian. The signs were there for anyone willing to look: the late-night meetings, the scent of a strange, expensive perfume clinging to his suits. Chloe favored the heady notes of Baccarat Rouge 540. A scent Amelia now associated with betrayal. The sudden, almost frantic generosity that always followed a particularly long business trip. At first, the pain had been a physical thing, a crushing weight in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She had loved Adrian, or at least the man she thought he was, the charming, brilliant architect of his own destiny, who had swept her off her feet at a Sotheby's auction. He had pursued her with a single-minded intensity, making her feel like the most cherished woman in the world. He had married her in a lavish ceremony at the St. Regis, a society event that had been the talk of the town. The illusion had shattered slowly, then all at once. The discovery wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet click of a laptop, an email left open. "My darling, see, I live for the moments we steal. A." Her first instinct was to scream, to throw priceless vases, to pack a bag and leave. But then she remembered her grandfather's words. Elias Vance was not a man given to emotional outbursts. He was a shrewd old-money patriarch who had built his own fortune in shipping before it was fashionable. On her wedding day, he had taken her aside, his grip on her arm surprisingly firm. "Listen to me, little bird," he had said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "That man you're marrying, he's a shark. He sees you, our name, our history, as another acquisition. Enjoy the ride, but never, ever let him see the cards you're holding. And always have an exit strategy." At the time, she had dismissed it as the cynicism of an old man. Now his words were a lifeline. So she didn't scream. She didn't cry, not where anyone could see. She swallowed her pain and began to plan. She played the part of the perfect, trusting wife, the fragile Amelia, with an Oscar-worthy performance. She redecorated their home, hosted his insufferable business partners, and smiled serenely at charity galas, all while her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Her pregnancy was not, as Adrian believed, a complication. It was a catalyst. It was the final piece of her strategy falling into place. It was the move that would checkmate the king. The inheritance papers spread across her desk were not from Adrian's side of the family. The Sterling fortune, vast as it was new money built on leveraged debt and aggressive takeovers. It was a house of cards propped up by Adrian's reputation. The papers in front of Amelia were different. They were from her grandfather, Elias Vance, and they were ironclad. Elias had passed away 6 months prior, leaving Amelia not just his immense diversified and debt-free fortune, but also his controlling shares in Vance Global, a logistics and shipping conglomerate with assets that dwarfed Adrian's real estate holdings. The catch, the beautiful, intricate, and utterly brilliant catch, was in the fine print of the will clause Amelia herself had helped her grandfather's lawyers draft years ago. The clause stipulated that full control of the Vance inheritance and the majority shares in the company would transfer to Amelia upon one of 2 conditions: the birth of her first legitimate heir or conclusive proof of spousal infidelity. Amelia's hand rested protectively on her belly. Her heir was coming. And thanks to Mr. Jones, the proof of infidelity was not just conclusive. It was a mountain of evidence complete with photographs, hotel receipts, and sworn affidavits. She had been waiting for the right moment, the moment of maximum impact. Adrian had been growing bolder, more careless, convinced of his wife's fragility and ignorance. He had started talking about restructuring his company, hinting at the need for a massive infusion of capital. He had even laughably suggested they use some of her family money as collateral for a new risky venture in Dubai. He was preparing to ask for a divorce, planning to offer her a paltry settlement, while he and Chloe rode off into the sunset on the back of her grandfather's legacy. He saw her as a bridge to a greater fortune. He had no idea she was about to burn that bridge to the ground. And Chloe, the ambitious, beautiful Chloe, was the perfect pawn in this high-stakes game. Her confidence, her belief in Adrian's promises, was the very thing that would make his downfall so exquisitely complete. Amelia almost pitied her. Almost. But pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. This wasn't just about a cheating husband. This was about survival. It was about protecting her child, her legacy, and honoring the grandfather who had taught her that the most dangerous sharks are the ones that swim in tailored suits. She picked up the final document. It was a notarized copy of Elias Vance's will. Tucked neatly behind it was a 1-page summary drafted by her lawyer outlining the immediate and irreversible transfer of assets. And on top of that, she placed a small, glossy photograph. It was taken by Mr. Jones just an hour ago. Adrian and Chloe locked in a passionate embrace on the balcony of the 157 penthouse, the lights of New York twinkling obliviously around them. She slipped the papers into a sleek leather portfolio. She checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her eyes, a deep, intelligent brown, were solemn. There was no trace of the fragile woman Adrian described. In her place stood a queen ready to reclaim her kingdom. "Time to go," she said softly to her reflection, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. The future, after all, waits for no one. The air in the 157 penthouse was thick with the scent of impending triumph. Chloe, wrapped in a silk robe that matched the silvery sheen of her hair, swirled a glass of vintage Dom Perignon, the bubbles a fizzing reflection of her own effervescent mood. Adrian was on the phone in the adjoining study, his voice a low, confident murmur. He was closing a deal he'd said the final piece of the puzzle. "It's done," he announced, striding back into the living room, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. He loosened his tie, the knot of a man unbound by convention or consequence. "The funding for the Dubai project is secured. We're going to build a new wonder of the world, you and I." He pulled her into his arms, his kiss deep and proprietary. "Everything is falling into place. I spoke with my lawyer today. We're drafting the divorce papers. A generous settlement for Amelia, of course. Something to keep her comfortable." Comfortable. Chloe's voice was laced with a playful scorn. "Darling, the woman wears beige. Her idea of comfortable is probably a lifetime subscription to a book club. Adrian laughed, a rich, booming sound that filled the cavernous room. Exactly. She won't fight it. She doesn't have it in her. She'll sign the papers, take her settlement, and fade away. And then my love? He tilted her chin up, his gaze intense. The world is ours. A real wedding. A family. The sterling name will mean more than ever before. This was the moment Chloe had been waiting for, the culmination of years of calculated patience. She felt a thrill course through her, a potent mix of adrenaline and vindication. She was no longer the secret, the footnote. She was the headline. She thought of the women she'd grown up with, the ones who had married for sensible, boring stability. They would all be reading about her, Chloe Duval, the woman who had captured the king. What about the inheritance? Chloe asked the question, a final, necessary piece of due diligence. Amelia's family. They're not exactly paupers. Adrian waved a dismissive hand. Old money. Slow money. It's tied up in trusts and ancient portfolios. She can't touch the principal without a board of trustees who still think the telegraph is a revolutionary piece of technology. What I'm offering her will be more liquid cash than she's ever seen. She'll be happy. Trust me. He was so confident, so utterly convinced of his own narrative. It was this absolute self-assurance that had drawn Chloe to him in the first place. He didn't just enter a room. He conquered it. He saw the world not as it was, but as he willed it to be. And in his world, Amelia was a footnote, a ghost. A sharp, authoritative buzz from the penthouse's private elevator cut through their conversation. Adrian frowned. I'm not expecting anyone. He glanced at his Rolex. The staff left an hour ago. Chloe felt a flicker of unease. They were 82 floors up, cocooned in a fortress of wealth and privacy. Uninvited guests were not part of the architecture. Adrian strode to the foyer, his annoyance palpable. Who is it? He barked into the intercom. A voice calm and clear replied through the speaker. A voice that was both familiar and chillingly out of place. It's your wife, Adrian. Let me in. The blood drained from Adrian's face. He shot a panicked look at Chloe, his composure shattering like a dropped champagne flute. Amelia, what the hell is she doing here? Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. Amelia. The ghost, the fragile, wilting flower. Here. Now. It was impossible. It was a nightmare. She scrambled to pull her robe tighter, suddenly feeling exposed, cheapened. The penthouse, which moments before had felt like her kingdom, now felt like a sup. Get in the bedroom, Adrian hissed, his voice a panicked whisper. Now go. But it was too late. Before Chloe could move, the elevator doors slid open with a soft, final ding. Amelia Sterling stepped into the foyer. She was not what Chloe had pictured. There was no beige cashmere, no mousy demeanor. Amelia was wearing a tailored navy blue maternity dress that hugged her bump, a picture of elegant power. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, accentuating the clean, aristocratic lines of her face. Her expression was one of serene, unassailable calm. She looked not at Chloe, but directly at her husband, her gaze level and unnervingly direct. And in her hands, she held a slim black leather portfolio. Amelia. Adrian stammered, his voice a strangled mess. He ran a hand through his hair, his earlier swagger completely gone. What are you doing here? You should be resting, the doctor said. The doctor said I should avoid stress. Amelia finished for him, her voice cool and even. And I've found there is nothing more stressful than living a lie. so I've come to end it." Her eyes for the first time flickered towards Chloe. It was not a look of anger or jealousy. It was something far more unnerving, a look of clinical assessment, as if she were examining a specimen under a microscope. "Chloe Duval, I presume?" Amelia said, her tone polite, almost conversational. "Baccarat Rouge, 540. A bold choice. My husband has terrible taste in perfume, and it seems in women." Chloe felt a hot flush of shame and anger. She opened her mouth to say something, to defend herself, to lash out, but the words wouldn't come. She was utterly disarmed by the woman standing before her. This was no ghost. This was a reckoning. Adrian finally found his voice, a blustering, desperate attempt to regain control. "Amelia, this is not the time or the place. You're not well. Let me take you home. We can talk about this, whatever this is, tomorrow." He reached for her arm, but Amelia took a deliberate step back, her movement fluid and certain. "Don't touch me," she said, the words as sharp and cold as ice. "We have nothing to talk about. Everything that needs to be said is right here." She walked past him into the center of the magnificent living room, the city lights framing her silhouette. She placed the leather portfolio on the marble coffee table with a soft, definitive thud. "You were telling Miss Duval about your future," I believe Amelia said, her eyes boring into Adrian's. "Your new wonder of the world in Dubai." The sterling name meaning more than ever before. It all sounded very ambitious. Adrian was pale, his bravado crumbling into dust. "Amelia, please. You told me you needed capital." She continued, her voice relentless. "You suggested we leverage some of my family money. You assumed my grandfather's fortune was a locked box, and that you, with your superior intellect, would be the one to pick the lock." She paused, letting the silence stretch thick with tension. Chloe stood frozen by the bar, a silent, unwilling spectator to the detonation of her own dreams. "You see, Adrian," Amelia said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "you made two fatal miscalculations. The first was underestimating my grandfather, and the second was underestimating me." She opened the portfolio. "This," she said, sliding the top document across the polished marble, "is a copy of my grandfather Elias Vance's last will and testament." Adrian stared at it, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Amelia continued, her voice a precise surgical instrument. "As you know, he left me his entire estate, including his 60% controlling interest in Vance Global, a company, I might add, that is currently valued at approximately $22 billion. A bit more than old slow money, wouldn't you say?" She let that sink in before delivering the killing blow. There was, however, a clause, a rather specific one. It states that my full unconditional control of all assets, including the immediate liquidation of certain trusts and the full voting power of the shares, is triggered by one of two events. She looked down at her stomach, her hand gently cradling her baby bump. "The first is the birth of my first legitimate heir, which, as you can see, is imminent." Then her eyes cold and hard as diamonds snapped back to Adrian. She slid the glossy photograph across the table. It landed face up, a perfect, damning image of Adrian and Chloe's passionate kiss on that very balcony. "The second trigger," Amelia said, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel, "is conclusive proof of spousal infidelity, which, thanks to your carelessness and the excellent work of my investigator, I now have in abundance." She tapped a manicured finger on the document. As of 6:45 p.m. this evening, when my lawyer filed this notarized evidence with the probate court, the Elias Vance spousal clause was officially activated. All assets, all shares, all control transferred to me, unconditionally, irrevocably. Adrian's face was ashen. He looked from the photograph to the will, his mind struggling to process the scale of the catastrophe. What does this mean? Amelia gave a small, humorless smile. It means, Adrian, that the bridge capital you were sourcing for your Dubai project, the loan you secured from a consortium that, unbeknownst to you, is heavily backed by Vance Global, has been pulled. It means the collateral you put up, namely a significant portion of Sterling Holdings, is now forfeit. It means that your company, which is leveraged to the hilt, will be insolvent by morning. She turned her gaze to Chloe, whose champagne glass had slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the floor. And it means, Amelia said, her voice devoid of any emotion, that the future he promised you does not exist. He told you that you were his future, but he was trying to build it with my inheritance, and he no longer has a single penny of it. She looked back at the man she had once loved, the man who had called her fragile. He looked broken, a hollowed-out shell of the titan he had been just minutes before. "You are not the king, Adrian," she said softly. "You were just a jester in my court, and your reign is over." With that, she turned her back straight, her head held high, and walked towards the elevator, leaving the ruins of 2 lives and a multi-billion-dollar empire in her wake. The elevator doors slid shut, and she was gone. The silence that descended upon the penthouse was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of a tomb, the suffocating quiet that follows a cataclysm. The city lights still twinkled outside, a mocking, indifferent audience to the carnage within. The shattered champagne glass on the floor was a perfect metaphor for the evening for their lives. Adrian Sterling, the man who bent skylines to his will, stood frozen in the center of the room. His face was a mask of disbelief, the color of wet concrete. He stared at the documents on the table, the will, the photograph, as if they were venomous snakes. He reached out a trembling hand, then snatched it back as if the paper itself might burn him. "No," he whispered. The word was a dry, rasping sound, a single crack in the monolithic silence. "No, it's not possible." Chloe, who had been paralyzed by the bar, finally found the ability to move. Her own dreams, so vibrant and close just moments ago, had evaporated into a bitter smoke. The penthouse now felt like a gilded cage, and the door had just slammed shut. "Adrian," she said, her voice tentative, thin. "Adrian, what did she mean? Insolvent forfeit?" "It's a bluff, right? It's a threat. She's just an angry, scorned wife." Adrian didn't seem to hear her. He was pacing now, a caged animal, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He tugged at his tie, which now felt like a noose. He ran his hands through his hair, dislodging the perfect, expensive styling. "Vance Global," he muttered, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying comprehension. The consortium. The lead investor was a shell corp based in the Cayman Islands. A subsidiary. Oh, God. He stopped pacing and stared at Chloe, but his eyes looked right through her. She knew. She knew all along. The Dubai deal. She didn't just pull the funding. She was the funding. She lured me in. She set the trap. The intricate, diabolical brilliance of it hit him like a physical blow. Amelia, his quiet, fragile Amelia, had orchestrated his downfall with the precision of a grandmaster playing chess. She had used his own ambition, his own arrogance, his own infidelity as the weapons of his destruction. He thought he was playing her, but he had been her pawn from the very beginning. Chloe's own mind was reeling. She wasn't a fool. She understood the language of finance and power. Insolvent wasn't a threat. It was a death sentence. The future Adrian had promised her, the society wedding, the status, the security, was built on the foundation of his empire. And that foundation had just been reduced to rubble. "So what does this mean?" she demanded, her voice rising, a note of hysteria creeping in. "What happens now, Adrian? Talk to me. It means it's over," he said, his voice flat dead. He finally sank onto one of the plush sofas, his body deflating as if all the air had been let out of him. He looked like a king who had just been dethroned, stripped of his robes and cast out of his own castle. "It's all gone." The anger came then, hot and blinding, replacing Chloe's shock. This wasn't her fault. She had invested 5 years of her life in this man and his promises. She had endured the whispers, the secrecy, the lonely holidays. For what? To end up with nothing in a borrowed penthouse, watching her future crumble. Gone. "What do you mean, gone?" she shrieked, her carefully constructed composure shattering completely. "You told me she was nothing, a ghost. You said you had it all under control. You promised me." "I thought I did," he yelled back, his own desperation and fury erupting. "How was I supposed to know she was capable of this? She reads poetry, for God's sake. She volunteers at the library. She's—" "Amelia. Well, Amelia just wiped you out." Chloe's voice was sharp, accusatory. "And what about me? Where does this leave me? You said you were leaving her for me. You said I was your future." Adrian looked at her, and for the first time Chloe saw not adoration or passion in his eyes, but a cold, resentful emptiness. In his ruin, she was no longer a prize to be won, but another complication, another reminder of his spectacular failure. "The future," he scoffed, a bitter, ugly sound. "There is no future. Don't you get it? I have nothing, less than nothing. I'm going to be buried in lawsuits and debt before the week is out. The life I promised you, the life we had, it was all fueled by money I don't have anymore. It's gone." The transactional nature of their relationship was suddenly laid bare, stripped of the pretty words and expensive gifts. He had bought her time, her affection, her loyalty, and now his credit was gone. "So that's it?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "You just lose everything, and I'm supposed to just— what, disappear? What do you want from me?" "Chloe," Adrian snarled, getting to his feet. "Blood, I have nothing left to give. My company is gone. My reputation is gone. My wife, my pregnant wife, just publicly castrated me, and I have a feeling she's only just begun." The mention of the baby, the legitimate heir, was another twist of the knife for Chloe. It was the one thing she could never give him, the one thing Amelia had used to seal her victory. The fight devolved from there, a toxic explosion of blame and recrimination. All the years of unspoken resentments, of power imbalances and deceit came pouring out. Chloe accused him of being a liar and a fool. He accused her of being a gold digger who was only with him for his money. In the heart of their love nest, surrounded by the trappings of a life that no longer existed, they tore each other apart. "You knew he was married," he shouted. "You told me you were leaving her," she screamed back. The argument raged until they were both exhausted, their voices raw, their anger spent. They were left in the wreckage Two strangers who had built a fantasy on a foundation of lies. Finally, Chloe walked towards the bedroom, not with the languid sensuality of before, but with the weary steps of a defeated soldier. "I'm getting my things," she said, her voice hollow. "Where will you go?" Adrian asked, not out of concern, but with the flat curiosity of a man surveying the extent of the damage. Chloe stopped at the doorway and looked back at him. The man she had once seen as a god now looked small, pathetic, drowning in the ruins of his own making. "I don't know," she said, and for the first time a genuine, terrifying uncertainty filled her. "But I know I can't stay here. This place, it's a graveyard." Meanwhile, Amelia was not at home resting. She was in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor of the Vance Global building, overlooking the dark expanse of the Hudson River. The room was filled with the quiet, focused energy of people who understood power. Her legal team, headed by a sharp, silver-haired woman named Eleanor Vance, a distant but fiercely loyal cousin, was assembled. A crisis management PR team was on standby. "The filing was successful, Amelia," Eleanor said, pushing a tablet across the polished mahogany table. "The transfer is complete. The board has been officially notified of the change in majority, ownership, and control." Amelia nodded, her expression serene. She took a sip of chamomile tea. "And the Dubai Consortium." "As you instructed," a junior lawyer chimed in. "The capital call was rescinded at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Time, citing unforeseen risk and material misrepresentation by Sterling Holdings. The default clause was triggered. Our acquisitions team is preparing the paperwork to absorb the forfeited assets. By our preliminary estimates, it will give Vance Global a significant entry into the luxury real estate market at a fraction of the cost." Amelia allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. It wasn't just revenge. It was good business. Her grandfather would have been proud. "What's our next move with Adrian?" Eleanor asked, her tone pragmatic. "For now, we let him drown," Amelia said calmly. "The financial press will get wind of the insolvency by morning. The sharks will start circling. Let him flail. Let him see who his real friends are. And the divorce. File it first thing in the morning," Amelia instructed. "On grounds of adultery. We'll be generous. We won't ask for a penny from him. The optics of that are important. This isn't about taking his money. It's about taking her power back. It's about him having nothing left." Her phone buzzed. It was Mr. Jones. Subject 2. "Duval has left the penthouse with luggage. Subject 1, Sterling, remains. He appears to be making a lot of frantic phone calls." Amelia typed a reply. "His calls won't be answered. See to it." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Amelia explained, "My grandfather taught me that in a war, you control the lines of communication. For the next 24 hours, anyone of consequence that Adrian tries to call his bankers, his lawyers, his board members will find their calls being mysteriously dropped or routed to a very apologetic but unhelpful junior assistant." Eleanor Vance chuckled a dry, appreciative sound. "Elias was a bastard. A brilliant bastard." "Yes, he was," Amelia agreed, a genuine warmth in her voice. She stood up and walked to the window, placing a hand on the cool glass. She looked down at the city, at the endless river of lights. It wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was her kingdom. She had not just survived. She had conquered. The fragile flower had revealed her thorns of steel. And as she looked out at her new empire, built from the ashes of her husband's betrayal, she felt not a shred of regret. She felt only the calm, steady heartbeat of her unborn child and the fierce, exhilarating promise of her own future. The dawn broke over Manhattan with a cruel, indifferent beauty. For Adrian Sterling, it was the dawn of a new, terrifying reality. The frantic, unanswered phone calls of the previous night gave way to the cold, hard print of the morning's financial news. It started with a leak, a single devastating article on the Wall Street Journal's website posted just before the markets opened. Sterling Holdings on brink of collapse as key funding for Dubai. Mega project mysteriously evaporates. The word mysteriously was a journalistic courtesy. Within an hour, the mystery was solved as rival outlets smelling blood in the water dug deeper. The narrative quickly coalesced. The pulled funding was linked to Vance Global, and the sudden seismic shift in control at Vance Global was linked to Elias Vance's spousal infidelity clause, activated by his heiress, Amelia Vance Sterling. By 9:30 a.m., when the opening bell rang on Wall Street, Sterling Holdings' stock was in freefall. It plummeted with a velocity that was breathtaking to behold. The company he had built from the ground up, the symbol of his genius and ambition, was being eviscerated in real time on the screens of every terminal in the financial world. Adrian sat in the silent penthouse, a relic of a life he no longer lived, watching the carnage unfold on a giant television screen. He hadn't slept. He hadn't showered. A half-empty bottle of scotch sat on the marble table next to Amelia's damning documents. His phone, which had been his scepter of power, now rang incessantly with calls he couldn't bear to answer. Angry investors, panicked board members, opportunistic journalists. His lawyer, a bulldog named Marcus Thorne, finally got through. "Adrian!" "What the hell is going on?" Marcus's voice was a frantic shout. "My phone has been blowing up." "They're saying Vance Global pulled your funding, that you're in default. They're saying your wife. That Amelia. It's true." Adrian said, his voice a dead monotone. "All of it." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. How is this possible?" The Vance inheritance was supposed to be locked up tighter than Fort Knox. "She had a key," Adrian replied, the words tasting like ash, "and I was stupid enough to hand it to her." "We can fight this, Adrian," Marcus insisted, his litigator's instincts kicking in. "We can challenge the will claim, undue influence, emotional distress." "Well, on what grounds, Marcus?" Adrian laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "That my pregnant wife was so distressed by my 5-year affair that she cleverly and legally bankrupted me. I don't think that'll play well in court. She didn't just beat me. She checkmated me. The game is over." As if on cue, there was another buzz at the elevator. This time it wasn't Amelia. It was a courier, a young man in a crisp uniform, who looked terrified to be there. He handed Adrian a thick envelope. Inside were the divorce papers, filed that morning. Clean, simple, and utterly brutal. Amelia was citing adultery and waiving any and all claims to his assets. She wanted nothing from him. It was the ultimate power move, a public declaration that he had nothing she could possibly want. Attached was a restraining order, preventing him from coming within 500 feet of her, her home, or any Vance Global property. He was officially an exile. He dropped the papers onto the growing pile of his life's wreckage. He was no longer just losing his company. He was losing his identity. Who was Adrian Sterling without the billions, the power, the name that opened every door? He was just a man in an expensive suit with empty pockets. For Chloe Duvall, the dawn was just as grim. She had spent the night in a sterile, overpriced room at the Mandarin Oriental paid for, with the dwindling credit on a card Adrian had given her. She had left the penthouse with 2 suitcases filled with designer clothes and a future that was a complete blank. Her phone was also buzzing, but not with business calls. It was her social circle, the coterie of wives and girlfriends of the New York elite. The news was spreading like wildfire through their encrypted chat groups and hushed phone calls. But the tone was not one of sympathy. It was one of schadenfreude, of vicious, triumphant gossip. "Did you hear about Chloe Duval?" The Sterling affair blew up in her face. Amelia Sterling took him to the cleaners, and the mistress serves her right. I always knew she was just a glorified call girl. Now she has nothing. Chloe scrolled through the messages, her stomach churning. These were women she had lunched with, vacationed with, shared secrets with. She had thought she was on the verge of joining their ranks, of becoming one of them. Now she was their cautionary tale, the Icarus who had flown too close to the sun and had her wings of Chanel and Cartier melted away. She had been cast out. The invitations would stop. The calls would go unanswered. The doors to the exclusive restaurants and clubs which had once swung open at the mention of Adrian's name would now be firmly shut. In the brutal social ecosystem of Manhattan, she had gone from predator to prey in the space of a single evening. Desperate, she tried to call Adrian. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. She knew then that he had cut her off just as the world was cutting him off. She was a loose end, a liability he could no longer afford. The final crushing blow came from her own family. Her mother called her voice a shrill symphony of panic and disapproval. "Chloe, what have you done? Your father and I are being humiliated. Everyone is talking, after all the sacrifices we made for you. For this is how you repay us. By getting involved with a married man and becoming a public disgrace." He was going to leave her mum. Chloe cried, the justification sounding weak and pathetic, even to her own ears. "Oh, stop it, Chloe. You thought you were so clever, but you were just a fool. You hitched your wagon to a falling star, and now you're going to drag us all down with you." Chloe hung up the silence in the hotel room, pressing in on her. Her mother's words echoed in her head. A fool. Was that what she was? She had seen her relationship with Adrian as a strategic investment. She had played the long game, banking on a future that now lay in ruins, and Amelia, the woman she had dismissed as a fragile non-entity, had been the true strategist all along. Amelia had been playing a different game. A game with higher stakes and deadlier consequences. And she had won. In the serene, light-filled living room of her Park Avenue apartment, Amelia was not gloating. She was methodically planning the next phase of her life. The news reports were just background noise. The collapse of Sterling Holdings was a mere footnote. Eleanor Vance sat opposite her, a file of resumes in her lap. "We need to appoint an interim CEO for the Sterling assets we've acquired. Someone to clean house and stabilize things." Amelia looked out the window, her gaze distant. "I have someone in mind." She picked up her phone and made a call. "Mr. Jones," she said when the private investigator answered. "How would you like a new job? I have a portfolio of distressed real estate assets that require a man with a certain attention to detail. The official title will be Head of Asset Management. The unofficial title will be My Bulldog." There was a pause on the line, then a low chuckle. "I think I'd like that very much, Mrs. Sterling." "Good," Amelia said. "Your first task is to liquidate the 157 penthouse. Immediately. I want all of his personal effects put in storage and the property sold. I never want to see it again." She hung up and looked at Eleanor. Adrian built his empire on glitter and hype. We will rebuild it on substance and stability. Vance Global doesn't build monuments to ego. We build foundations. Her phone rang again. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. Hello. Amelia. It's Chloe. The voice was shaky, stripped of its former purring confidence. Amelia was surprised. She had expected never to hear from the woman again. What do you want, Chloe? Amelia's tone was not harsh, but it was not welcoming. I just wanted to say, you won, Chloe said, her voice cracking. You were right. He's a liar, a user. He promised me everything, and he left me with nothing. I wanted you to know that I see that now. It was a strange, pathetic olive branch. Perhaps Chloe was looking for sympathy, or perhaps absolution. Amelia felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a kind of weary understanding. Chloe was a casualty of Adrian's war, just as She-Hulk had been. They were on opposite sides, but they had both been betrayed by the same man. Seeing the truth doesn't change what you did, Chloe. Amelia said, her voice firm, but not unkind. You made your choices. You gambled on a man's character, and you lost. I gambled on my own strength, and I won. That's the difference between us. She continued, my advice to you is this: stop looking for a man to build your future. Build it yourself. You are more than just someone's mistress. Or at least you can be. Goodbye, Chloe. She ended the call, leaving Chloe on the other end, stunned into silence. It was not the conversation Chloe had expected. It was not forgiveness, but it was something more valuable, a harsh, unvarnished truth. Amelia placed her phone down and put both hands on her belly. The baby kicked a strong, reassuring flutter. This was her future. Not a company, not a fortune, but a new life, a legacy of her own making. She had walked through fire not to destroy a man, but to forge herself anew in the flames. The world would talk about the fall of Adrian Sterling, the billionaire who lost it all. But Amelia knew the real story. It wasn't about his fall. It was about her rise. 6 months later, the New York City skyline was unchanged, but the landscape of power had been irrevocably altered. The name Sterling was no longer synonymous with audacious success, but with catastrophic failure. Adrian Sterling's bankruptcy had been swift and brutal, a textbook case study that would be taught in business schools for years to come. He had lost everything: the company, the penthouse, the art collection, the respect. He was a ghost in the city he had once commanded, occasionally spotted by paparazzi, looking haggard and lost, a spectre of his former self. Amelia Vance, however, was no longer Amelia Sterling. Having legally reverted to her maiden name, she had become one of the most formidable and respected figures in the global business world. She did not rule with Adrian's flashy, aggressive style, but with her grandfather's quiet, strategic brilliance. Vance Global, now bolstered by a shrewdly managed real estate portfolio, flourished under her leadership. She was known for her calm demeanor, her sharp intellect, and her utter unflappability. The press had tried to paint her as an avenging ice queen, but the narrative failed to stick. She was simply too competent, too focused on the future to be defined by the drama of the past. Her greatest achievement, however, was not in the boardroom. It was the small, perfect child who now slept peacefully in a bassinet in her home office. Elias Vance II, named after the grandfather who had taught her to be a warrior, was the center of her universe. He was a daily, gurgling reminder of what she had fought for. Motherhood had softened her edges, but hardened her resolve. She was building an empire, not for herself, but for him. One sunny afternoon, while rocking baby Eli in her arms, Amelia looked out her Park Avenue window. Down on the street, she saw a woman exit a yellow cab. The woman was dressed in a simple, professional-looking pantsuit, her once silvery blonde hair now a more natural honeyed shade. She carried a leather briefcase and walked with a purpose that Amelia had never seen in her before. It was Chloe Duval. Amelia was not surprised. After their final strange phone call, Amelia had tasked Mr. Jones, now her fiercely loyal head of asset management, to keep a discreet, non-invasive eye on Chloe. Not out of suspicion, but out of a strange, lingering curiosity. The reports had been interesting. After a few weeks of floundering, Chloe had disappeared from the social scene entirely. She had sold her designer clothes and handbags on luxury consignment sites. She had moved out of the expensive hotel and into a small, modest apartment in Brooklyn. And then she had enrolled in a course to get her real estate license. She had started at the very bottom, working for a small independent brokerage, fetching coffee and making cold calls. She was, by all accounts, relentless. She worked 18-hour days, using the knowledge of the luxury market she had gleaned from her time with Adrian, not as a shortcut to glamour, but as a tool of the trade. She was no longer trying to marry a real estate mogul. She was trying to become one small commission at a time. The gossip columns that had once delighted in her downfall now occasionally mentioned her in a different light as a tenacious, up-and-coming agent who was making a name for herself through sheer grit. Amelia watched as Chloe strode down the block and disappeared into a brownstone. She felt a complex emotion, not friendship, not forgiveness, but a quiet, detached respect. Chloe had taken her advice. She was building her own future. Perhaps Amelia mused there were many kinds of fragile. There was the fragility that breaks, and there was the fragility that is merely a shell waiting to be shed so that something stronger can emerge. Her thoughts were interrupted by a call from Eleanor Vance. "Amelia, I have some news about Adrian," Eleanor said, her voice grim. "He's been trying to secure funding for a new venture. It's pathetic, really. A small-time development in Queens. He's been using his old name, trying to trade on a reputation that no longer exists." "And?" Amelia asked, her voice neutral. "He's been approaching some of our lower-level investment managers. One of them flagged it. It seems he's making promises he can't keep, misrepresenting potential returns. It's dangerously close to fraud." Amelia was silent for a moment, listening to the soft breathing of her son. The old Amelia, the one consumed by the fire of betrayal, might have seen this as an opportunity to deliver the final crushing blow. To leak the information to ensure he was not only bankrupt, but possibly imprisoned. But she was not that person anymore. Her victory was complete. Pounding Adrian into the dust now would be a petty act, a waste of energy she would rather devote to her son and her company. Revenge was a fire that consumed everything, including the person who wielded it. She had her son. She had her legacy. Adrian Sterling was a footnote in her story, and it was time to turn the page. "Eleanor," Amelia said finally, her voice clear and decisive, "do nothing. Let him be. His ventures will fail or succeed on their own merit or lack thereof. He is no longer our concern. His name is not to be mentioned in this office again. We look forward, not back." "Understood," Eleanor replied, a hint of admiration in her tone. Amelia hung up the phone and looked down at her son. His eyes, the same deep brown as hers, blinked open and stared up at her. In them, she saw not the past, Not the betrayal or the pain, but an infinite, unspoiled future. She had walked into that penthouse with inheritance, papers ready to burn a kingdom to the ground. And she had. But in its place, she had built something far more valuable, far more enduring. She had built a life. And it was a life that was entirely gloriously her own. The fragile wife was gone, and in her place stood a queen ruler of her own destiny, mother to a prince and the architect of a future built not on promises, but on strength, integrity, and the unbreakable power of a woman who had decided to save herself. And that, my friends, is the story of how a woman who was underestimated, betrayed, and left for broke turned the tables on the powerful man who wronged her. It's a reminder that the greatest strength often lies where we least expect it, and that a person's true worth is not in the money they have, but in the character they reveal when everything is on the line. Amelia's journey from a supposedly fragile wife to a formidable queen wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclamation. She reclaimed her name, her power, and her future, proving that the best inheritance is the strength you find within yourself. If you were on the edge of your seat listening to this story of drama, betrayal, and ultimate triumph, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a story of epic payback. And to make sure you don't miss our next Millionaire drama, be sure to click subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have so many more stories of intrigue and karma to share with you. Thank you for listening.